Heroes Group, and I am so pleased to have all of the folks here, America's Heroes Group Roundtable on Public Policy. It's just great to have them here. February, of course, is African American History and American Heart Month. Today is February 1st, and we are so pleased to have all of our folks here. Colonel Dr. Damon Arnold.
Hey, Cliff.
Hey, how are you?
Counted for and present.
Great. You just took Rochelle.
I was sitting so close to Rochelle. That spilled over. I'm sorry.
No, he did.
Yeah, he did. Miss Crump, Rochelle, how are you?
Present and accounted for, sir.
That's the right order.
And my good friend, love him, and the consular attorney, Ernesto Borges. How are you, consular?
Great. Good afternoon.
Good. Does anybody know how talented you really are? I'm not talking about as a lawyer and all. We all know that, but, huh?
My wife.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. People don't know, but this man, I don't know about that. But this gentleman is a real actor. I mean, he's just, I remember seeing you the first, what were you to the bar thing
Right,
on the Bar Association?
The Bar Association, Christmas Spirits.
Right, it's Christmas Spirits, yeah.
Jim Montgomery and I used to be up.
Yeah.
I was with Jim last night, as a matter of
Oh,
fact.
did you? Yeah.
Yeah.
You were better.
Yeah,
Thank you. Yeah, right.
Thank you.
Right.
Don't get offended, Jim.
And of course, the man who counts the money and knows where it all goes, Sean Claiborne. How you doing, Sean?
Doing my best.
Great. Well, we got some good folks here. Listen quickly, 'cause we got a lot to talk about here. The topics, the discussion. Here's a CNN audio. 50 U.S. service members diagnosed with traumatic brain injuries after an Iranian missile strike. Do we have that?
The CNN's been working this all day to confirm these numbers, and a short time ago, the Pentagon did publicly now acknowledge there have been 50 U.S. service members, U.S. troops, injured in Iraq with concussion and traumatic brain injury symptoms by that Iranian ballistic missile attack on January 8th, which sent massive blast waves across the al-Assad military base in Iraq. 50 troops now injured. This is 16 additional cases alone since last Friday, when it was 34 cases. 16 new cases. Thankfully, 15 of them have returned to duty, and of the 50, more than 30 have returned to duty. So all of that is good news. But 50 people. Listen to what President Trump had to say about this just a few days ago.
I heard that they had headaches and a couple of other things, but I would say, and I can report, it is not very serious.
So you don't consider potential traumatic brain injury serious?
They told me about it numerous days later. You'd have to ask Department of Defense. No, I don't consider them very serious injuries relative to other injuries that I've seen.
Wow.
Okay, so what are we talking about here? Worth remembering, these kinds of concussion injuries emerge over time. There's no way of knowing right away. People report symptoms in the days after these blast waves. So what the Pentagon is concerned about now, and they are very upfront about this, there could be even more. They had to medically assess about 200 people that were within the area of the blast waves back on January 8th when the Iranians attacked. The Pentagon very prepared to see these numbers go higher, giving people treatment, sending them back to duty when they are able to. But by any measure, this certainly is now a mass casualty, mass injury attack, if you will, against U.S. troops at the hands of Iran.
Dr. Arnold, respond to that, would you?
Well, we talk about traumatic brain injury. It actually sometimes is very often overlooked or missed because usually it's in the setting of other forms of trauma. So if you have chest trauma, if you have something else going on where you need surgical intervention or medical intervention, those take priority. And usually you end up maybe in an operating room suite. And so they don't really focus on that portion of it. But as it was mentioned, traumatic brain injuries can actually evolve over time. So it doesn't have to present itself immediately. It can take days, months, weeks, and sometimes even years before they're detected. They can be very subtle. They can be lifelong, and it usually affects your cognition. And what cognition really means is when it starts to describe the process of thinking, of how you do your reasoning, problem solving, and then also information processing and memory. And there's some very specific tests, Glasgow Coma Scale. There's some other neuropsychological testing that needs to be done. And what needs to be told is that you do not have to actually have changes on a CT scan or an MRI scan. It doesn't have to have a physical change in that scanning. And so that's not a tool to be used to rule it out. And you also have to be aware that in those situations, many times people are also exposed to post-traumatic stress disorder, things that will trigger that as well, and depression. So these things can overlap, and we should not be making assumptions. Many times when I've seen people doing the TBI testing, even the novices or the people who don't really know what they should be actually doing, they'll say, well, you have depression, so we don't really need to do these neuropsychological testing. That is total bunk. And those people need to be retrained and to think about really how do you really diagnose PTSD, how do you diagnose traumatic brain injury, and know what the difference is and whether they are combinatorial, they're happening at the same time. And what the military focuses on three things. It's like a loss of consciousness that occurs during the episode. That's not necessarily necessary for you to actually have traumatic brain injury and to have those types of symptoms showing up. And then a behavioral change. They look at also whether you are having problems with coordination or your motor activities, how you pick things up, how you move your legs and your arms, and how you function.
Thank you, Doctor. There's a handout from The Guardian. Ernesto? Yeah.
Yeah, The Guardian, which is an independent newspaper publication. Well, they commented on this, and we know about the VFW. And the VFW was a bit upset that the president kind of dismissed what happened as to any injury. Now, traumatic brain injury is something very serious, as the doctor indicated, and there's another element aside from the traumatic brain injury, which it doesn't always manifest itself right away, as we said. You could get ear injury. You can get tinnitus. I have tinnitus. I have a very bad case of tinnitus, where you have ringing in your ear for the rest of your life. Right. And it is extremely disconcerting, to say the least. And, in Vietnam, I remember being with the howitzers and sleeping next to howitzers, and the next day, your ears are ringing, or a mortar attack. And I can imagine this is a rocket. This is more than a mortar. These guys, you should, I guess, be careful because it's insulting to the military to say they've got headaches. As I said, this could be some serious lifelong injury that they sustain, not on their brain and their ears. And I had my reunion with some my mates in Vietnam, a 40-year reunion, and every one of them had ear. I was the only one without a hearing aid in, and they were all suffering from loud noises and sounds, and certainly these huge rockets that came into that fire base. So it's just the president, VFW, other organizations are a bit upset, and I hope that the president would address that and make sure that they are taken care of, because it's...
Excellent point, Ernesto. Well, we have a CNN audio. CBO projects a decade of trillion-dollar deficits and soaring U.S. debt.
America lives on borrowed money. That's why the terms debt and deficit get thrown around so much. But of course, they're not the same thing. Let's first start with our definitions. If a government spends more than it takes in a given year, the difference is called a deficit. Debt, or the debt, is the total sum a government owes. So every year with a deficit, the debt grows larger. Looking at a chart, we see that in 1950, the debt was around $257 billion. That's compared to now at around $22 trillion. But comparing the debt then to comparing the debt now is a bit like comparing apples to oranges. That's because when you talk about the deficit, you need context, and the first thing to keep in mind, inflation. With inflation, that $257 billion debt in 1950 suddenly becomes $2.8 trillion in today's money. But you also have to look at the total size of the economy. Our economy has grown tremendously since 1950. We have more money, we have more assets, we have more people. That's why when economists talk about the debt, they prefer to use this number, the debt to GDP ratio. It takes the total public debt and shows how big it is relative to the gross domestic product. So now if we go back to that debt comparison and instead show the debt as a percentage of the total economy, well, it's a different story. The US number right now is around 106%, which is the highest it's been since World War II. And if you're wondering if that number's too high, well, there's no simple answer. Some economists say 85% is too high, some say 100%, some say even higher. But regardless of which number is right, economists agree. These are the numbers you should be looking at.
It is very interesting, and we have to go to our person who knows all about money on the panel. Sean?
Well, the thing is about, I mean, there's a lot of things they kind of throw out in the video. And what people are talking about nowadays when it comes to debt, and they're talking about also what happened with our issue of treasuries. So when we talk about debt, what we're really talking about are government bonds. So U.S. Treasury bills, what China borrows again, or lends us a lot of money. How when they say why is China holding all our debt, because that's how they can manipulate their currency. When they have a lot of bonds, which are basically just IOUs, money we owe other countries, they basically can then take interest off of the U.S. Treasury, because the United States Treasury is actually paying interest to China. And then what happens is they can do a lot with that, because their currency goes a lot further than, or our currency goes a lot further than their currency. So $1 here in the United States can barely get you a Happy Meal, but in China, with $1, you can buy me a new outfit. So when you look, that's what we're really talking about when we break it down in dollars and cents for people, everyday people to look on the street. But the thing that people are concerned about is that over the last really 20 years, our deficit's been growing, and our debts and our issuance of bonds have been growing at a crazy rate. The only thing that's been kind of helping us a little bit is we had a booming stock market. So with the booming stock market, people aren't really investing in bonds here in the United States as much, but we have a lot of that debt still floating around overseas. So during the Obama administration, there was a big crisis people forgot about, but it was a big, huge issue of the fact that they were saying that we had our credit rating lowered because we had so much debt out there. Well, I mean, that came and gone. It came out to be a non-event, really. The United States is still the safest bet in town when you try to borrow money from any kind of government agency. The United States Treasury is considered the safest investment in the world. #1 safest investment is considered the U.S. Treasury. So that being said, is it a scary future we have because our debt's out of control? We've been in this situation many times before. Ronald Reagan did this way back in the day. You know, we got out of that during the Clinton years, but then we got into it again when George Bush gave away $30 billion to go start the Iraq War. So now we're back into it again during all the stuff we did to try to stimulate the economy to get out of the housing crisis. So now we're back in a situation where we have a booming economy, which usually coincides, by the way, with high debt, a booming economy. And we also have the situation where we don't know what the future is going to bring. Or we're going to get into this prolonged trade war with China going to start to unfold. If China starts selling off their debt or getting rid of their bonds, it weakens their currency so they can make more money. But then it also becomes an issue for us when we start to worry about how can we afford to pay more debt. All that means in the long run, higher taxes. And at some point in the future, we're going to have to pay more taxes to cover all this debt. That's basically the bottom line for the everyday consumer.
I don't care what question you ask, this group can answer it. And Robert, you hold on, we're going to take your question, but right now we want to make sure, I don't want anybody to think that we are not giving full attention to our ladies that are here also. We have another CNN audio we'd like to hear. Listen up.
Our next story is a CNN special report about military sexual assault. So a warning that what you are about to hear is graphic. As the Supreme Court begins its new term today, it will decide whether to take up a landmark case on how the military prosecutes rape. At issue are rapes and sexual assaults that happened between 1986 and 2006. And that is significant because it often takes victims years and years to come forward, especially in the military. And some of those victims are only doing so now. The Trump administration is siding with rape victims who have gone to trial and seen their rapists convicted, including one who raped 2 women, only to have those convictions thrown out because of a ruling last year by the top military appeals court. Now it's up to the Supreme Court. Do they take up this case? Do they overrule the military justice system? I sat down with 3 women whose lives have been turned inside out by this military court decision. I've been asked over and over and over and over and over again, what is it that you want? My answer has been the truth to be told. Jennifer Elmore's father is retired 2-star Army General James Grazioplane. She says she was 3 years old when she first remembers him sexually abusing her. In the summer of 1974, we came home to visit my grandmother in upstate New York. I took my underwear down and he masturbated himself, touching me. I knew not what really was happening, but I knew I was terrified and this was very bad. The abuse escalated to rapes, she says, and continued for years. In 1986, her mother, Anne Marie, wrote to a family member that her husband was taking perverted liberties with my child and had made an attempt at sexually molesting Jennifer. She was sleeping, thank God, and I caught him before he got started. Anne Marie Grazioplane, who is still married to her husband, told CNN her words had been distorted. The Army charged the general with 6 counts of rape, more than 2 decades after the alleged abuse stopped. Grazioplane pleaded not guilty, but he never saw his day in court. That's because the top military appeals court ruled in a separate case, U.S. v. Mengahas, that rapes between 1986 and 2006 have a statute of limitations of 5 years. The court had reversed long-standing precedent.
Wow. Unbelievable. Of course, we have to go to...
Yeah, shame on all of them.
That's
I'll
right.
say that first.
That's
you
right.
know.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, this continues. This is, as you see, going back to the 80s and still having these type of issues, not resolving them, passing the buck from one court to the other, from the military side to the civilian side. It just doesn't make any sense because the same rules should apply everywhere and all the time, you know. And then, you know, we kind of talked about this before. These bad behaviors come into the military. They don't just exist in the military. They come in with that bad behavior. And, you know, that mother did probably all that she could at that time. But a lot of times they take their time doing that, too, because they think about their welfare as well. You know, he was a 2-star general. And so she probably was thinking about that part and their lives falling apart, whether or not they're going to believe her or not. You know, so sometimes it takes people a longer time to report it because they're afraid that they're not going to be believed. And then they're faced with consensual, you know, in other, not this particular case, but in other cases, whether or not they have to prove whether or not this was consensual. He says this, he says that, you know, so it's a hardship on women. And then where do they go when they're in the military? You know, they don't really have a sound foot in being able to defend themselves without, you know, the court system, and they're disappointing. You know, they're not really siding, it sounds more like, with the victim.
Yeah.
You know, they're survivors too, but they're also victims.
Sure.
And, you know, it's a hurtful thing because we're not talking about just a small population of women.
Right.
We're talking about a whole mass of women who have been going through this for the longest. So it's not anything new, but it's disheartening, even with the Supreme Court. It's disheartening.
Let me ask a question.
Yeah.
Though, because, you know, we've got a commander-in-chief back. This happened, when was this determined to be the statute of limitations? Was that when, who was president then? Was it 2000 when Bush was president? I would think something of that magnitude would need the approval of the commander-in-chief if you're going to talk about
that the statute
of limitations. You set it at 5 years.
And why is there a statute of limitations?
There should be none. Right. There should be none.
Yeah.
Right.
I agree with you. Yeah.
And then
I have another question, though, for both of you, for you, Rochelle, and also for you, Ernesto. You know, with this situation, she's 6 years old, so she wasn't in the military.
Exactly.
So why can't they do a civil action against him, you know, outside of the military code of justice system?
Right.
Because, you know, when we talk about military rape, you know, whether it's a man or a woman, we have a tendency to, you know, look at, you know, this interaction between service members and not
True.
their family. So this was really something that was both on the,
And what is the legislative bill going to do also? What are the changes to it? I'm interested in knowing what those changes are, because we still have this problem with them not being, even when they've been accused, not being sex offenders. It should be a bipartisan bill with legislation in order to get all of those bills passed to help our women.
Yeah.
Because then you don't want to take care of them after they're having all these problems, PTSD and everything else that comes with that. You know, it's just a circle that we go through, just a circle.
But you know, as Doc says, why couldn't this be treated in the civilian court?
Absolutely.
We tend to do this with the military and the church, and keep it within the church, keep it within the military. But this is a criminal act, even though it probably happened on federal territory. You can still report it to the U.S. attorney. It's still criminal.
Right.
Maybe you can't go to the sheriff, but you can certainly go to a U.S. attorney and file a complaint. And you know, I just tend to think a mother has to know
what's going on. It's not a mystery.
And I know it's not easy for her, but still, it's your daughter. You know
because
what's happening.
something happens to a child, and the doctor could probably speak more to that at 6 years old if they're being messed with.
Right.
You know, let's just face it. Their behaviors change. They start wetting in the bed. There's all types of things. They're afraid of everybody. There's a whole slew of things that happens to your child when your child has been normal and then something's happened.
Let's take a caller. Robert, thank you for calling.
Oh, thanks for giving me a call, Cliff.
Yes,
yeah, I wanted to make a comment about was it a doctor who was discussing the TBIs?
TBI, yes.
Right. Yeah. The VA will have a propensity to deny those because they'll say that the injury wasn't severe enough to cause any critical issues. Because I just had an assessment for TBI at Jesse Brown. And it's documented in my records. And the physician who examined me said, well, you know, and I have the results. Said, well, he's earned a college degree since he's come out of the service. He finished a explosive handling course in 1984. And, you know, they and her assessment really speaks to them denying the claim. And there are other issues that can cause similar or overlapping issues with TBIs. The dioxins used in Vietnam are neurotoxins. And that can cause imbalance or memory loss and other things similar to a TBI.
Yes,
so
yes.
That's my comment.
Yes, sir. And, you know, the chemical
Thank you, Robert.
imbalances.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, so you know, you have chemical imbalances that caused by different substances that can enter your body, and actually the actual traumatic brain injury. The reason why they do a CT scan and MRI scan is to see whether you have a structural problem, like a subdural hematoma, collection of blood around the brain, or you know, damaged tissue, scar tissue, that kind of thing. But you need to have someone that actually is very well trained in that arena, that knows how to do those evaluations. You know, I always go for a second opinion. You know, if I had to go to a private entity to actually make sure that the diagnostic conclusions that were reached are actually accurate, I would try to go outside. And that sometimes will you know, you have much more sensitive tests with some centers rather than just relying on one center. So that would be my recommendation to you.
Can I just say this?
Yeah, go right ahead.
The symptoms have been the same from those who have served in the military. The terminology is different. Is that it? You know, because from way back in World War II, you know, the shell shock, post-traumatic stress syndrome, so the symptoms have already been the same. So they've already done studies and research and all of that. You know, why are we still just having a hard time, you know, taking care of the men and women who serve?
Yeah, and
that's the bottom line.
Yeah, and I think it's because the way that we're looking at it, we have PTSD, we have depression, we have other anxiety disorders, and then we have traumatic brain injury, and trying to separate those out can be somewhat difficult on a clinical diagnostic level. But this, when you start talking about TBI, it's a clinical diagnosis made by someone who is trained and understands what they're looking for.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
You folks are great. We'll be back in a moment. This is the Talk of Chicago, 1680 WVON.